Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here. I'm going to do another one of these little informative videos because this is a topic that really I can try to condense down for you guys and put it in the simplest layman's terms possible. But there's always this talk in the community by people who don't really fully understand the way the body adapts to things, where they talk about muscle confusion. You have to do things to change, to confuse the body, to make it grow. A lot of this is really anecdote from the bodybuilding world, but to really understand what's actually going on, you need to understand that oftentimes the methods that they're using, bodybuilders and other people are using for quote-unquote muscle confusion is actually hit or miss. They are right. The body absolutely adapts to the same training stimulus, but you shouldn't just be randomly or arbitrarily changing things. There are well-developed protocols that are used by professional athletes or at top-level, elite-level athletes by coaches all around the world that we've developed over many decades of research that give you ideas to not just randomly change things, but to know what you need to change. What's going to change the training stress and adaptation to facilitate further growth and adaptation? Because generally, anytime a muscle gets stronger, it grows at least a small amount in some way. So even if we're talking about your gains, changing the stress on it is what causes it to grow. And it doesn't have to be a change in one specific type of stress. It can be a change in any type of stress, whether it's total mechanical tension, total metabolic fatigue. So let's really kind of look at some of these things. Now, the thing you need to realize, what we've noticed over the years, and even the Russian scientists and exercise physiologists figured this out back in the 50s and 60s, that there's what's called the law of accommodation. That means a given training stimulus will only make the body adapt if you keep it exactly the same for about 3 weeks. And every week beyond the first week, you're going to see a smaller and smaller training response to it. So if you were to come in, for example, and on your bench press, you were to do exactly 3 sets of 8 reps with 3 minutes in between with 200 pounds on it. Let's say you go with 200 pounds and you don't change anything. You're going to respond and grow and adapt in the first week. You're going to get a slightly reduced response the second week. And by the end, the third week will get the same thing. It'll still continue to adapt to it, but it will be a much smaller response. And beyond that, you won't gain any more real size or strength by doing the exact same workload. And it doesn't matter if you're doing it multiple times through the week. It still seems to work over around a 20 or 21 day cycle. So what you need to do is learn to change things. And you can change anything in there. If you change a training response in some programmed manner, whether you're using an undulating method where you change reps from day to day, as long as there's an upward trend, you're going to see improvements. And what I mean is that if at any point during that 3-week interval, you can add a rep, or you can add a set, or you can add 5 pounds to the bar, or 2 kilos for people who aren't in the United States using the imperial system, you're changing the training stress. Or even in some cases, what if you can shave the training, the time down between the sets? Even if you shaved 15 seconds or 30 seconds off the break, you're going to induce more metabolic fatigue. You're going to increase growth. So if anything is disrupted, meaning your training load improves, one of the stressors that stimulate change becomes more difficult. You will stimulate new training response. Now, a traditional method that's been used for this, if you take something like my linear intermediate off-season program, which I'll link here and down below for you guys. It's a pretty popular program I put out over a year ago. You'll notice that what I do, I change it every week, but they're small changes. What you see, you'll notice like the first week in the program, I have people doing 3 sets of 10 with, I believe, 70% intensity, 70% of their max. The very next week, because they're doing it multiple times in a week, like twice a week. So the next week, I increase their sets. They go from 3 sets to 4 sets. We've reset the law of adaptation slightly. Now we're keeping the same basic fatigue because we're still working with the same weight, same reps. But by adding a set, we've induced more metabolic fatigue. They're going to grow as a result of that. Now, granted, I know the first week the person isn't necessarily anywhere near their max. They're capable with 70% of doing more than 3 sets of 10. But the thing is, we're giving them a nice, good baseline training response. The next week we go to 4 sets. The next week I have them go to 5 sets. That third week at 70%, that becomes very difficult to do. That third week we're really pushing the limits of what they can adapt to, and they're almost overreaching at that point. So it peaks up the total volume. Then the following week, to let the metabolic fatigue recover and adapt, so they'll grow from it, I cut the sets back. We go from 3 sets or 5 sets of 10 down to 3 sets of 8. But I increase the weight on the bar 5%. We go to 75%. And you see the same thing. So we've adapted, peaked out our adaptation to increasing the metabolic response, or the metabolic overload. You trim it back down so that you can adapt to that, and you increase tension. So then we add a new training stimulus, increasing the intensity on the bar by 5% is a pretty large amount. So let's say you had been working with 200 pounds at 70%, you're going to go up like 15 or 16 pounds for your work sets. That's a significant training response, but it's no more difficult on the body than what we were previously doing. With the increased tension, the body's going to have to adapt. It's going to have to get stronger. Muscle tissue is going to grow. You're going to get a neural response. You're going to improve strength. You're going to improve size. Then I repeat the process. You increase sets the next week, increase sets the next week, just as you're starting to peak out to what the body can adapt to from the metabolic fatigue by increasing the volume. You repeat the process. You cut the volume back down, add more weight, and this is called linear periodization. It's a very classic model of training. It's been used successfully for over 50 years in top-level athletes around the world. It is also a very viable method for someone to get big if they choose the right exercises for what they're trying to do. You know, obviously, exercise selection, exercise diversity becomes really important there. But what people need to understand is that things like this aren't random. What we've done is we've programmed in for a 12-week period of time a set of changes to get around the law of adaptation, to change training response on a weekly basis in a programmed manner that works off of the 3-week adaptation process. So we're actually changing not just weekly, we're changing the volumes, but every 3 weeks we're changing the type of training stimulus. We're actually increasing intensity every 3 weeks to bypass the law of accommodations. So what people need to realize is that these are not random things. When you just do it randomly, you just randomly change exercises, or you randomly change what you're doing to shock the body, that doesn't work. Shocking the body doesn't do anything unless you just happen to have added more workload that one day. So you're going to adapt, respond, and grow to that if you recover from it. But there's no guarantee that the workout after that is going to cause you to grow. So doing it randomly and using this whole muscle confusion thing just doesn't work. It might work. You might get lucky. It might work half the time. It might even work 60% of the time. But unless you're using a programmed model, then there's no way to ensure it's going to work. All right, now something else that's also being used more and more these days is more of like concurrent style training or undulating periodization. And that is where every single workout, you actually change the workloads that people are using. Now, a lot of people are calling these things like power hypertrophy routines and things like that. I don't think that's really an appropriate name from an exercise science perspective for a lot of reasons. They would probably be better if they refer to them as mechanical tension, metabolic fatigue hypertrophy workouts. Those are things that make more sense in exercise science. And even most of those aren't really power at all, so it's kind of funny they call it that. But still the idea is the same, that you're talking about an undulating style of periodization to where in the middle of the week you're actually training a different training stimulus. You're almost changing energy systems because you're doing fairly low volume with very high intensity on certain days. And by doing that, you're stimulating large amounts of mechanical tension to, again, get upper threshold muscle fiber recruitment. But you're also giving your body a chance to recover, because what happens with that is that too many high tension workouts back to back, it actually can fatigue your peripheral nervous system, and it's not always easy to recover from. You can't always do those for long periods of time unless they're programmed really well by someone who knows what they're doing, like when you're dealing with things like Bulgarian light style training, to where you're hitting training maxes almost every day. But if you're going to do them a certain way, if you're not going to be on very large amounts of drugs, you're going to want to train quite a few days a week with a fair amount of volume. This style of training works very, very well, because you're coming in, you're using all this mechanical tension, you're loading peripheral nervous system, but then the next workout with all your big movements, you're going to more metabolic fatigue. You're using a much lighter weight, you're going to use higher reps, and therefore you stimulate additional metabolic fatigue, which causes a tremendous amount of muscle growth. You're still growing off the other stuff, maybe not as much as off of this, but the changes in the neural efficiency and the motor unit recruitment is allowing you to be a little stronger. You'd be able to use a little more work as you're adapting and recovering from, just as you peak from the adaptation from the heavier days, and therefore you can stimulate even more metabolic fatigue to grow a little faster. But you're not taxing the peripheral nervous system with a really heavy weights the way that you are on the higher intensity days. So what ends up happening is that you're allowing your peripheral nervous system to recover more, and you're taxing yourself more metabolically. And then as you're taxing from the metabolic fatigue, you're going back to the days to where you're lifting heavier with a higher intensity. So you're able to train more frequently while taxing slightly different systems. And if you're still recovering from the metabolic fatigue, from the previous week, it won't always affect your high threshold strength. It won't let you do a lot of volume on the strength days, but it won't affect the amount of weight that you can put on the bar and lift. So this sort of method is becoming very popular because of that, because it is allowing people to actually completely bypass the law of adaptation in the middle of the week and change things up so that their recovery systems are not fully overlapped, meaning you can use a different style of training that requires a slightly different type of recovery that's not impacting your other one. And this sort of concurrent training, I think, works really, really well for people who are trying to gain strength and muscle while improving endurance and cardiovascular capacity, because you can do the same sort of thing. You might have 3 or 4 days a week dedicated to your weightlifting, and then you're able to do large bouts of endurance-based cardio on the other days. And if you time everything right with a training style like this, you now have 3 different types of training stimulus throughout the week. You've got the heavier high tension strength training, you've got the higher volume metabolic training, and then you've got your true endurance work. Now, they can all negatively affect each other's recovery and adaptation to some extent, but if you time them right, a person can actually gain muscle mass, they can gain maximum power and strength, and they can improve their cardiovascular capacity all at the same time by rotating through these different types. And so they're actually experiencing 3 completely different type of training stimulus through the week and adapting to all of them. Now, they're not adapting to any of them as well as if they had focused on just one, but the overall training stimulus and adaptation is going to be an upward improvement. People can actually improve at all 3 things at once if they do this right. And again, is it muscle confusion? Maybe that's what a lot of bodybuilders mean by muscle confusion. They're talking about changing things up like that. But in this case, if done right, this is pre-programmed. It's not random. You're not doing anything to shock the body. You're gradually changing training stimulus to keep the body from adapting. And remember, guys, that you're always going to get better results in the long run if you do things that are programmed training adaptations that you know that you can adapt to and recover from and change them over time, so that there's a general increase in the workload and the things that you're forcing your body to do in the gym. But if it's done in a correct manner, you'll recover from it and adapt to it, and you will make progress throughout the year round without just randomly trying to shock the body and confuse it. So this is a much more intelligent approach that works off of the same idea that bodybuilders have kind of anecdotally discovered that's hit or miss, and using modern exercise science and physiology that's used with real athletes to understand that you can actually control these changes and guarantee that you're going to adapt rather than shock the body and hope that it adapts. So hopefully that kind of explains the difference, and people realize that training programming is a little more complicated than that, but it's honestly the principles behind it. Once you understand the basics, it actually becomes really simple again in a lot of ways. It's just about balancing adaptation and changing and increasing workload that your body has to adapt to with your recovery. And for people who aren't really advanced lifters, it's not that difficult once you grasp the basics to keep it fairly simple while doing this. All right, guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.